We are going to follow the same format as yesterday.
Brilliant.
I am not going to introduce you. You are free to introduce yourself, however you see fit. But thank you for joining us. I also wanted to recognize that as a consequence of what you lead and do, it is an extraordinary privilege to have you here in person and on stage, sharing with us some of your perspectives on what you've done for the past 2 years and what you think the future holds with regard to your remit. So please take the floor.
Well, thanks so much, Sanjana. And for those who haven't met me, I'm Paul Ash. I work in the Department of the Prime Minister and Cabinet as the PM Special Representative on Cyber and Digital and as the Cyber Coordinator there. First, I'd like to say a big thank you to the National Centre for the opportunity to come and join you today. We've been really looking forward to this and the Christchurch Call team and to being part of the opportunity for a conversation. So hats off to you, Sanjana, and to the team for pulling this together. I'd like to talk a bit about the Christchurch Call and what it is, and by doing that, partly what it isn't as well. In part because I think listening carefully yesterday, it was apparent to me that one of the things we do need to do better is actually tell the story of the Christchurch Call and build participation across the New Zealand community in the work. I guess a couple of things struck me out of yesterday as a preface to that. The first, I think it was Sarah O talking about the need to think systemically and strategically about some of these challenges. I think Susan Benesh made much the same observation, and the Christchurch Call is one of our efforts to do this in a particular problem set. The second was that by the end of the day, I think it would have been possible to leave yesterday feeling pretty gloomy and full of despair about the internet as a whole. And it's really important as we take our work forward to understand all the positive things that the internet has delivered and continues to deliver, and to work out how we preserve those. If we think about the moment in time we're in, I think, and go back to the mid-90s and the height of tech utopianism, the declaration of the independence of cyberspace, we're a long way on from that, and we've discovered the internet's probably a more Hobbesian world than we expected. I'm not sure why that surprises any of us. That should have been obvious. But we always like a utopian vision, and we'd all like to be able to preserve the best of that. That's something that I think, as we go through today, will be really important. The Christchurch Call itself is a direct response to the abuse of the internet by the Christchurch attacker 2 years ago this week. It's a multi-stakeholder effort, and that's critically important. It actually is about bringing governments, industry, and civil society together to work on problems collectively. It's grounded in the fact that all of the actions taken under the call must be consistent with international human rights law and with fundamental freedoms and with the principles of a free, open and secure internet. That sets a pretty high bar for those that would want to operate under the call. It's a set of voluntary commitments. Now, they are non-binding at law, but they are commitments and they have been made in public by those who participate in the call, and there's an expectation they will be upheld and that the call community as a whole will help to ensure that that happens. There is a growing community attached to the call. It's not just a document, but actually a large grouping now of countries, companies and civil society working together to try and solve a particular problem. It contains specific commitments for governments on their own, for companies on their own, and for the two of them working together, and a key role for civil society in participating in that. It's deliberately holistic. It takes a range of measures that are aimed at preventing the abuse of the internet, and it works across online and offline factors in trying to do that. That means that the commitments in the call cover a range of technical measures. So there's something for the computer scientists. Ali will be happy about that. But there's also a lot in there for the social scientists and humanities people, public policy folk. There is research, there is soft and black letter regulation and regulatory tools. There is education, counter speech, some specific technical tools. All of those are actually encapsulated within the commitments. And as we watch the problem growing, the problem set we're dealing with, we've actually been quite pleasantly surprised to find that the drafters of the call, and one of them is in the room with us today in the form of Liz Thomas, now with Microsoft, but was with NZ government as we were developing that, did a pretty good job of anticipating what the terrorist and violent extremist content problem set would look like and the kinds of measures we might want to put in place to deal with it. And I guess the last piece is that the call is actually quite tightly constrained to that problem set. It's about terrorist and violent extremist content. And those 5 words are actually really important. It's not about the whole panoply of disinformation. It's not about electoral interference. It's not about child sexual exploitation or any of the other sorts of issues that we're grappling with. The intent was to take the proximate problem and the problem set and see how far and how deep we could go on trying to solve that. And if we could make progress there, perhaps we could find a blueprint for some of the other issues that bedevil us at present. I guess the last thing is it's deliberately collaborative. The effort is to try and bring the recognition that governments cannot solve this problem on their own, nor can companies, and nor can civil society. And as the PM has said many times, we can't just regulate our way out of this problem. We're actually going to have to think quite creatively about the tools we have to preserve the best of the internet and solve this. Where to from, where have we got to date? So in terms of the Christchurch call, it's now got a very, very strong support base. We have 48 countries that have joined as supporters of the call. We have 3 intergovernmental organisations, one of which is the European Commission, which obviously has an enormous remit. We have 10 tech companies, from the largest in the world through to some smaller ones. We've also now, in recent times, added our first Asian tech company in the form of Line Corp out of Japan as a supporter of the call. And if you think about Line Corp, they've done some absolutely intriguing work in Chinese language markets and in Korean markets in recent times. And it's great to have them on board. We have a very active Christchurch Call advisory network of civil society members. We know it's very active because we engage with them all the time, and we really value the input they bring. And it can be quite confronting and challenging input. That's precisely why we have that network, to get that range of perspectives. And I think one thing I would advocate for those participating in this discussion is, if you'd like to think about participating in that network and contribute to the work of the call, please feel free to get in touch with christchurchcall.com. And the Christchurch Call inbox. I think we really value that diversity of input. What have we done to date? Well, there was a stock take last year of the call's work across the entire community. We sought input from everybody, and they found 4 key things that had been achieved to date. And I'm talking meta rather than specific actions. The first and thing that most participants valued most was the unique multi-stakeholder approach of the call. And its focus on preventing terrorist and violent abuse, extremist abuse of the internet. That was really heartening to hear that from almost all the participants, because it spoke to the value of bringing those different capabilities together to work on a shared problem set. The second was around the lift in awareness of the problem of terrorist and violent extremist abuse of the internet, and delivering some channels to engage on that. The third was around building crisis response protocols. What we saw in Christchurch was unprecedented, not because terrorist acts are unprecedented. In fact, we had a good conversation on that last night, but because the use of the internet in Christchurch and the response online was unprecedented. We've never seen an event live streamed before that has over 1.5 million uploads taken down on Facebook over the 24 hours afterwards, or that sees YouTube having a copy of the attack video uploaded every second for 24 hours afterwards. This was a deliberate effort by the Christchurch attacker that worked really well to subvert the controls that such as they were that existed at that time. And what's more troubling is that there was a very, very sizable community, technically proficient and able to continue to pick up on his work, who worked really carefully to try and subvert all of the algorithmic processes and other things that tech companies had in place to hide the video off in the recesses of the internet and then pump it back edited. Over 800 different copies of the video within the first 24 hours, edited, changed. All it takes is a pixel or two to be able to put that back in. We needed to respond to that, and we put in place crisis response protocols under the call. There weren't any at the time, or to the extent there were, they were manifestly inadequate for what we were now confronting. And there are now 3 of those in place, a piece of company work, a Christchurch Call crisis response protocol, which deals very much with communications and the politics of crisis response. How do you think about both reducing harm, but also managing the social context around that? And then work that the European Commission and Europol have put together, which is very much around the material that investigators and prosecutors need. It's very much based in legal frameworks. And those 3 pieces are actually kind of critical to any crisis response. The last piece I think that the survey pulled up was the reform of the Global Internet Forum to counter terrorism. And that's been a major piece of work. The Christchurch call really has been the key driver of that reform. It is the body that we would expect would pick up on many of the commitments in the call and provide the multi-stakeholder context for that. Previously, the Global Internet Forum had no staff. It had a brand. It had 3 programs, but it rotated around 4 tech companies. And while it presented well publicly and had some good work around hashing and some good work around research, it didn't really have critical mass or buy-in and really didn't provide a multi-stakeholder forum. It's now an independent organisation. It has a whole range of working groups working on specific problem sets. It has an independent advisory committee of governments and civil society working with industry, and is a real shift in capability. The full results of that stocktake will actually be released reasonably soon with some forthcoming events. And we will make sure that the data is open data that will be provided for researchers to work with. I guess it raises the question for us now, coming to the 2nd anniversary of the launch of the call on 15 May of where to from here. What do we do next? And perhaps that's something that would be really helpful to get feedback from anyone listening to this discussion, whether here or internationally over the coming weeks. We've got a bunch of work prepared and underway for 15 May. For those of us working on the call, we end up living very strange hours here in New Zealand, being up through the night working on that and have done for quite some time now. Effectively, I'll leave to the PM to announce what those next events look like, but we are currently working on what the 3rd year work program for the call would look like and how we intensify our efforts in some key areas. The first of those is working across all of the participants in the call to grow the sense of a self-sustaining community, one that can continue to work actively and that is facilitated to work on the issues or commitments that sit in the call. The second is around dealing with some specific priority areas. The first of those is making sure that the resourcing and work of the GIFCT is consolidated, that it's a genuine multi-stakeholder workplace, and that we build confidence amongst the participants. Some of this work is going to require real trust across some sectors that have struggled to do that in the past, and it's going to require some real openness. And that's a hard thing to do. We can see examples of that elsewhere. If we think about the child sexual exploitation area, over the years, we've actually seen multi-stakeholder work and trust circles that have done some extraordinary things in that area, and we would like to see some of that replicated. Same in cybersecurity. The ISACs, the CERT networks do this on a trust basis, and we want to be able to build that in this problem set. And it's going to take a bit of time. The second, and it's come up over the past day quite a bit, is deepening the work on algorithmic processes that have the potential to lead to radicalization. Now, this is a particularly sensitive area. We've heard it in the last day. It's a topic of global debate at the moment. One of the strange things here is that our evidence sets are actually relatively limited for this work. And we need to build a stronger evidence base for the work we do. Our focus primarily in the call is on the outcomes of those algorithmic processes. It's not on grabbing the source code and playing with it. And I think I heard someone talk yesterday about just allowing an 18-year-old to change the algorithm. It's not that simple. Algorithmic processes learn on their own. They change, they shift, they can do that, as we see with things like software-defined networks in milliseconds. And we think it's probably more helpful for most of the people involved to look at the outcomes of those processes and set up some multi-stakeholder test beds so that we can then design effective interventions where there are problems. Either algorithms need changing, or we do things that we've learned from public health. How many of you have ever Googled suicide? Okay, what happens? You get redirected, you get interstitials, and those interstitials are context specific. So wherever you are, they will direct you to local resources. There's work in terrorist and violent extremist content to do some similar things. There's a lot we can learn from public health, and a lot we can learn from actually treating the people that end up being radicalized as victims in this process as well. They are not always, out there to perpetrate this stuff. There are some people who are, and we need different tools for them. But we need to be thinking across those disciplines about what interventions look like and how we practically focus on them. That will require computer scientists, and it will require specialists in public policy and health and other areas to actually work collaboratively together, and require companies to participate in that actively. That's where we want to head with that algorithmic work. 3 other key things that are important for us. First, we want to add a small number of countries to the call. we're probably getting to the point where the number of countries that can meet the human rights level protections and will actually treat the call in the spirit that it is intended is becoming reasonably limited. But we do want to bring some more on and make sure that we can actually build that capacity. The next is actually lifting the number of companies involved. We've got some really big tech companies in there. We would like to see that grow as we start to think about the network effects and the way that the internet stack works to promulgate terrorist and violent extremist content. Our first priority in the call was to get the content away from the largest number of eyeballs, work with the big platforms first. And over time, we're going to have to start to stretch that out a bit and think about CDNs and web hosting services and how we actually think about the services that host some of the worst of the content. This was the topic of a really tricky discussion with the internet companies when we first started building the call. But actually, it was really interesting watching that discussion and ending up in a room. Liz and I were both there, actually, whiteboarding this with some of Silicon Valley's most senior executives. Their question to us, do you really understand the internet stack? Our response, we think we understand a lot of it. Tell us more about what you know. Once we started mapping that out, actually, it was helpful for them to see that we knew what we were talking about. That gave us credibility, but it was also helpful for some of those companies to say to their colleagues, no, we can't just exempt this whole area of the internet from this work. And by the way, in terms of web hosting, we've already conceded that because we kicked this organization off our platform a year ago. And so if you think that's taboo territory, we've already gone there. Let's take an open mind to this. And what was really interesting about that, I'll just riff on this for a minute because it's important.
Well, if you could,
is that big tech is not one amorphous blob. It's actually a whole range of different things we need to work with. And there's lots that we can do in those spaces. The last thing is around growing civil society capability. That's going to be critical for taking this work forward. There are some other areas, and we're really open to hearing those for the next work plan. Social cohesion being one that has been brought to the table by civil society. And we are going to keep working that through as we get to the third year work plan. I guess in closing, I'd say, if you are interested in the call, go back to the text, go back to what's been agreed in the voluntary commitments, work off that. And if there are things in there that are interesting, come back to us. We would be really keen to engage with you on that work. I'll stop right there, but I think looking ahead, there's a really active piece of work over the next couple of months and a work program to deliver in the third year that it will be really important to preserve that multi-stakeholder approach for.
Paul and I were talking, and this has been the common leitmotif of the Christchurch call in New Zealand, is that so few people know about it in Aotearoa. But of course, it is more widely recognized outside. So there's an interesting, perhaps worth also exploring why that is the case. But I can assure you that the call is very highly regarded, as is the PM's leadership and your work in the Commonwealth and also beyond. Part of this is also to present to you snapshots of the research that NCPACS has done that I've led over the past year as a consequence of my doctoral research into the manner in which Twitter reflected and refracted Christchurch 2 years ago. I'm a very hesitant academic, and I'm not a data scientist either. But what I did was, as I said yesterday, in the immediate aftermath of what happened, I pivoted my doctoral research to look at what was happening in Aotearoa as opposed to what was happening back home in Sri Lanka, which I came here to study. And then one of the op-eds that I published in the local media looked at around 170,000 tweets in the first 48 hours after the massacre. That piqued the interest of Twitter, leading to the Data for Good initiative and partnership, as a consequence of which I looked at about 800,000 tweets and about 14.3 million words in the 6 months after the attack. That has fed into the thesis chapter and that I'm now going to present some interesting perspectives on. And why do I do this? It is not self-promotion. If anything, it is about the work that NCPACS does. But something that I think frustrates many of us is the simplistic narrative around the demonization or the deification of social media platforms. It is one or the other, constantly in the media. Anecdotal, episodic, stochastic, but it's either accompanies all bad or it's all good. And a lot of the nuance, of course, is lost as a consequence of that. Paul, you know this. And one understands why the media does it, because what's very bad or what's very good makes a great story, but it is not a good story for academia. I'm not going to talk about it today, but one of the interesting things that I found out and why this chapter is so interesting for me as a researcher is because it is fundamentally different to the manner in which Twitter reflected and captured the Easter Sunday terrorism in Sri Lanka. And as a consequence of this research here, we find that, unsurprisingly, there is a connection between the political, social, communal culture and the timber and tenor and trust of political leadership, and what is then reflected on Twitter as a platform. That, that really matters. So I'm going to come back to that a bit later, but to just give you a sense of what I found through the research. It's quite extraordinary, really. The tweets in response to Christchurch were in a couple of languages, not even remotely kind of connected to the country. So a lot of, I'm talking about tens of thousands of tweets came in Urdu and Hindi and Turkish and Hausa. Hausa is a language spoken in certain parts of Africa, Urdu and Hindi respectively in Pakistan and India, and Turkish obviously in Turkey and other places in the world. Now you would wonder why, and then I go into that data as well. And one of the reasons is that some of the TV anchors who are celebrities in those countries, when they tweeted about the loss of lives of Pakistanis or Indians, or about the loss of life in general in Christchurch, gathered a huge amount of interest in their respective countries and languages. That was an outpouring of empathy and pro-social content creation around Christchurch. Really quite extraordinary. Academics call this digital togetherness, and you saw that exclusively almost in terms of the content that came just in the 48 hours after Christchurch. Now, for many of you in the room, this might not be extraordinary, or it might be passé, or you might wonder, of course, it's Christchurch, it's our country, people should be outraged. But that's not the way actually generally the narrative of social media works after terrorism, both leading to terrorism and in response to terrorism. Generally what social media does is that, as even after Christchurch on some platforms, is that it amplifies the worst amongst us and the worst we can be. Here you found the amplification of our better angels, not just in Aotearoa, but globally. So that's, there's something there that really bears more reflection and study. It happened in lesser degrees, but in similar fashion after 2015's Bataclan attacks in Paris and the 2011 attacks in Norway. And so there's some kind of continuity in the studies that suggest that certain political cultures lead to certain kinds of responses on social media after a cataclysmic event. And I can say that for Sri Lanka, that it led to certain things in the timber that happened, that was present on Twitter after our Easter Sunday, that was very, very different to Aotearoa. What is also really, really interesting for me is that I cannot find statistically important or statistically prevalent measure of hate after Christchurch on Twitter. There was no glorification of the perpetrator. There was no glorification of the manifesto in any language, including in Arabic, for 6 months afterwards. That is not just a consequence of the platform cleaning itself up. You just can't find it. It was almost as if PM Ardern's family, which she also often refers to as New Zealand as being, extended to the rest of the world. And these are just top-line snapshots of data that is quite extraordinary. It's extraordinary for me, and I keep repeating this because it's really fundamentally different to the kind of things that you saw on the same platform after Sri Lanka. So to give you an understanding of why this is interesting is that, and yesterday, some of the panelists spoke of certain platforms as evil, as bad, as wrong, as contributing to toxicity and violence. And yes, all of that is true. But when you look at it, that's the rub. And, when you look at it a bit closer, Twitter in particular, but all social media platforms in general, depending on time, depending on the event, depending on the people on it and speaking on it, depending on who they are and what language and what time and what geography, what hashtags. There's a whole range of things that make it such that social media is a complicated beast, and you can't kind of have this black and white approach. And one of the things that I think David Hood from Otago is going to kind of treat us to later on today is how Twitter in its exchanges within Aotearoa is fundamentally different to Twitter in Sri Lanka. So why is that? So David has some answers, I have some answers, and I think it's really, it bears reiterating that social media is not one thing or the other thing, and that within a platform and that between platforms, there is contestation. I want to end by reading out the last couple of chapters from my chapter, which last couple of paragraphs from my chapter that I think will place this all in some context, and also what Paul said as well. So I quote, the Royal Commission of Inquiry's report into the terrorist attack on Christchurch mosques on 15th March 2019 notes how the killer's live stream and violent ideology went viral on social media, including Twitter. However, complicating the report's findings, my research reveals how on Twitter there is scant evidence of content inciting hate that results in sustained or even episodic engagement in violence. On the other hand, the Christchurch massacre brought out, and not for the first time, how social media platforms are ill-equipped to deal with the amplification of gore, violence, and terrorism. However, from media ecologies to political culture, it is clear that many variables determine the use and abuse of social media within and across countries and contexts. So the next chapter, I need to give a bit of context because a staffer of Otago University came up to me on the 15th and said, Sanjana, you must be used to this. And I didn't quite know how to respond to that person. I think that person meant it in the best of way, thinking that I came from a country that is, of course, no stranger to suicide terrorism and violence in general. And I think the person wanted some sort of an acknowledgement that I don't know, but maybe that I was emotionally more competent and capable of understanding what happened in Christchurch. I don't know, and kind of my entire chapter and thesis is a reflection on, of course, a very personal engagement with violence, and of course, violence in a country that I never expected to study it in. So that's the context to the next paragraph, and I quote, I started this chapter with how hard it is to answer whether I am, quote unquote, used to dealing with terrorism. Through chance, coincidence, or conscious choice, the circumstances of my life have perversely perhaps contributed to mental conditioning that aids the study of the grotesque and gore. And yet, it is not and never easy to study violence and hate. And Kate, you'll agree with this. New Zealand's tryst with terrorism was tragic. However, the Christchurch massacre's representation on Twitter generates a much stronger case for understanding the context within which social media works. Engrossed in data collection on 15th March 2019, I did not realize the time passed by. By early evening, the university was deserted. The office janitor, Dave, took pains to assure me that he was ashamed of what happened and that it was antithetical to everything that New Zealand stood for. Very sweet, actually, of him. Go home, he said, saying that he was concerned for my safety given the visible police presence on the streets. His concern pleasantly surprised me. I'm glad my research proves he was not an exception, end quote. I end by recalling, and again, Kate, you'll understand this as perhaps the only two humanities students in this room, the Nigerian author Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. And she spoke of the danger of the single narrative. And I think that what Paul and the PM and Christchurch call as a platform offer within Aotearoa and New Zealand and to the world is a reflection that I see in the data of my research as well, that there is no one story. Adichie warned us against stereotypes because as appealing as they are not the whole story. And very often you find the stereotypical reflection and capture of social media, which of course makes a great headline, but it's not the whole story. It's not the whole story here. It's not the whole story in Sri Lanka. It's never the whole story. And that's kind of what I wanted second day to reflect on as well, complementing what Paul you had to say. So thank you very much for listening to that rant around my research. Listen, to get into the discussion, I know you don't want to take away the thunder from whatever the PM wants to announce in terms of what next. But just for also the Zoom audience who might not have been present yesterday, I think to go back to Richard's point about you are talking about a fundamental setup, a systemic nature of, say, the violence and its generation and hate and its formation and harm and its amplification, that maybe late stage the call, as you presented it, doesn't quite grapple with. So, I think Richard was trying to suggest that there is an addendum here that's all very well and good, but what about the social cohesion part of the RC report, for example, that is possibly much of it is actually offline. And little of it is online. So in terms of the future steps moving forward, I think we all understand and appreciate that the call is actually very limited and you presented it very carefully. But can you tell us, in light of the fact that the RC report is now public and there is this emphasis on social cohesion, what, if anything, is the call going to do around that issue?
It's a really good question. And I guess the first thing I'd say is the scope of the call is to look at the abuse of the internet.
Yep.
And it's from that perspective, then we go back to the drivers of the abuse of the internet for terrorist and violent extremist content. So the call actually has commitments on that. It requires governments to look at that work and to do research jointly with companies, to engage civil society in that work. There is work underway through the GNet, which is part of the GIFCT. I mean, one of the big lifts, I think, is in the quality of the research consortia that are working in this area now, and in the diversity of the material that they're starting to produce. And a lot of that goes back to social cohesion and the issues that actually drive offline activity that then is amplified and magnified online. Here in New Zealand, the Royal Commission work, there are the 44 recommendations, and a lot of those go to social cohesion. And we have with us today, I think, my colleague Manisha Bika, who has been working on this with the rest of the Royal Commission team. You've seen, I think, the 33 hui that have been conducted around the country. That is an attempt to try and shift the way we work on this in New Zealand from a government-centric piece. I think we heard from Kate yesterday about the, what's the word? The nature of government being perhaps less diverse than it should be. I was a diplomat once, so I'm framing that differently than Kate.
Kate, what would you say?
I think I probably reflected white and middle-aged and middle class. Okay, sorry, white and middle class. I think there's work to be done there, and everything I've seen across government is that ministers and the government genuinely committed to that work. To the extent that other countries are looking to do that work as well, I think that's going to be a really important part of the call over time. But in a sense, the call will draw on other work rather than necessarily generate it, if I